The last video on this S10 Blazer was a while back, but the basic gist is that I found it on Craigslist in 2016 with a very honest title and reasonable asking price, fixed it up enough to drive it, spun a rod bearing on the original V6 engine, and dropped this exquisite small block Chevy V8 in its place. After going through the transmission and rebuilding that fine specimen of an engine, we put the Blazer through 10,000 miles of mistreatment. Despite plenty of small repairs and housing a bird's nest or two during periods of neglect, it has somehow held together and remained very popular among everyone in the comments. So it's about time we caught you up on the last 5 years before an angry mob kicks down my door. We may as well start at the beginning, when one day the truck started running warm and I realized that the electric radiator fans were no longer spinning up. Previously, this happened as a result of roads rough enough to make the fuse go all melty, and this time it was the relay connector that liquefied due to rainwater corroded terminals. I ditched the plastic housing entirely, using the bare terminals to connect the relay through a tunnel of tape. This did the trick and got the fans going again for just over a year, at which point the relay itself gave up and was replaced with a weather-sealed one. That problem required immediate attention, but at the rear of the truck is one I've been ignoring like my life depended on it. The lower shock mount is loose in the spring plate, and has been that way for so long that the threads are completely seized, and in fact the shock has become one with that mount. I figured it was about time that I splurged and replaced all of this poor thing's shock absorbers, although I was still too cheap to get color-matched ones for the rear, so those got a sand and paint treatment to help them fit in. We also have new lower shock mounts ready to go, which is good since this old one is going to have to be cut off. In fact, the passenger side shock mount, which wasn't all rattly, wasn't giving up either.
It doesn't want to do anything. It's pretty fucking rusty.
So, back to the angle grinder we crawled. With both sides loosed from the axle, we can only hope that the top sides are less... Holding a wrench on the bolt heads above the frame will impact those loose, and looks can be deceiving because they came off totally fine on both sides. Shiny new hardware in hand, we'll drop a bolt in, raise a freshly painted absorber to meet it, and once that's hanging on its own, we'll install the new lower mount to the spring plate. But...
minor issue. That's too big.
I'm not totally sure whether the shock or the mount is incorrect, but these half-inch bolts sure do, mostly, fit. We'll torque those to 50 foot-pounds, the uppers to 18, and after the wheels are back on, make sure the limited slip differential is still limiting slip as we torque them to 100. Back on the ground, the new shocks are definitely absorbing more than the old ones, and doing so with entirely less clunk. The front shocks ended up waiting, but at least the rear ones were on there helping out when, 2 months later, Rob and I took the Blazer for a nice long highway drive. Other than the ringing in our ears, everything was going fine until, on the way home...
Something smells like hot rubber. Yeah, it smells like grounds. I don't know what to do about that. Oh, it's getting worse, dude. Can I pull over? You're not trailing smoke or anything weird. What would that be?
We popped the hood at a convenient stop and sniffed out the cause. The exhaust manifold gasket had failed and was directing a torch of hot air directly upward into the rubber valve cover gasket. If it melted all the way through, we'd have the fire hazard of oil on the manifold, so this demanded attention. Making do with what we had, I crumpled up some aluminum foil and jammed it in between the two warring neighbors. The rest of the drive home was completely free of ode day tire fire, and as is often the case, that temporary fix became permanent and the crumpled foil is still working hard in there to this very day. We are quite fortunate that that long drive didn't have bigger issues, especially since exactly 2 weeks later, I started to hear a rump 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 noise, opened the door to check, and saw the rear tire almost completely deflated. The Blazer limped to a nearby gas station, and for once it turned out the culprit wasn't just a rogue drywall screw. The valve stem was dry rotted and had developed a hole where it passed through the wheel. With no other option for a quick fix, I brought out the zip ties and spent a quarter refilling the tire. It made it home just fine, and I put out a jack stand to prevent the truck from sitting on the flat, but somehow those magic zip ties held for almost a month with no noticeable air loss from the quick detach valve stem. I didn't want to drag all those tires to a shop for an unmount, stem change, remount, and rebalance though, so I picked up a tool with a hyper-specialized purpose: installing valve stems from the outside. Gone are the days of invasive surgery just to switch out those wobbly air straws. We have technology. We'll use a floor jack to lift up just enough to unload the tires, and maybe some wheel chocks would be a good idea, before we let out some air. None of the valve stems look great, but for the intact ones, we'll pop out the valve cores to relieve the internal pressure. The first part of the specialized toolkit is this handle that threads onto the stem, which will allow us to pull outward on it while we lubricate everything in a half-mile radius and slide this hook tool down past it. Once inside the wheel, we can give it a twist and use both tools to pop the stem out of there. Then we can use the rest of our production budget oiling up a new valve stem and this funnel that we're going to force the stem through once it's up against the wheel. And if the stem goes too far, it's no big deal to pull it back out into place. Once we fire up the air compressor, it's on to the next corner. There is some fiddling involved in this process, but it did work quite well. I imagine it wouldn't work on all wheels though, especially aluminum ones with recessed stems. Fortunately, we were able to swap these out without too much trouble, and even the tire that was driven on while nearly flat never showed any problems. The new valve stems, however, looked like this after just a year and a half, so maybe don't buy the cheapest ones you can find on eBay. While all of these other problems were cropping up, I had been working diligently to ignore a pretty big one. No, not the birds who keep nesting behind the grill, the driver's window is falling into the door. This isn't uncommon on these old trucks, but it is a significant headache when the summer rolls around, so to keep myself from liquefying in that steel oven, we'd better fix it. With the window rolled partway down, we can see that one of the plastic window guides has broken off and is just hanging out, so let's go ahead and free it. That clip saw one too many ears and one too many potholes, so we have a new set of guides ready to step in and take on that burden. There are a pair of them on each window, and to get to the front one, we'll need the door panel out of the way. Off comes the upper section of door trim, then we have rusty grab handle screws to remove, and these two non-factory fasteners keeping the window switches from rattling around. Once we pop loose the various clips holding the panel to the door, we can easily remove and disconnect those switches, allowing the panel to be fully removed. Underneath it is a layer of foam, retained by more clips, and we'll reconnect the switch so that we can position the glass just where we need it. Once we move the wiring loom to make a little more space, we can see where the front guide once was, fish the old one out of the door, and begin the awkward surgical dance of finagling the new guide into position. Despite no small amount of effort on my part, however,
These just were not fitting. I could not click them on. This has tiny little tabs there. The old one has two, but they're much shorter. I took this one and trimmed those little tabs down to about half their original height.
it still required a good deal of force to install, but that went right on this time and doesn't have any wiggle to it, so I'm hopeful it will work out fine. For whatever reason, the rear guide didn't require trimming and went right on. Now we can straighten the window out and get the rear clipped into place. For the front, we'll just roll it up and the motor will take care of it. I can feel the cool breeze of a functional window already, so we'll work through everything in reverse to reassemble the door with a few less intact panel clips and some fresh-faced fasteners. There we have it, a life-saving miracle at work. While we're poking around, we may as well take a minute to replace the front shocks that I had been avoiding. The old ones don't seem obviously terrible or anything, but they aren't exactly pretty. They are pretty easy to get to at least, and once the impact persuades both the bottom and top ends to come loose, we can give it a little pry to pop it out of there. Replacements were nice and inexpensive, and offer significantly more dampening than the who knows how old one we just liberated. Once we have that in place, both bolts will be torqued to 55 foot-pounds. The same swap will happen on the passenger side once... whoa. I'll be honest, I knew there was a hole in one of the upper control arms, but it got way worse, way faster than I expected it to. I don't think the arm is completely compromised yet, but it will be soon enough, so that's something to keep an eye on, and replace ASAP. We may as well deal with the outer tie rod boot while we're here. It has disintegrated and the least we could do is swap it out. Once the stud has been freed, the glob of rubber and grease can be removed, the joint cleaned and flushed with fresh grease, and a new polyurethane boot installed. With the tie rod back in place and torqued to 35 foot-pounds, the driver's side boot, which is also torn, will get the same treatment. Once both front wheels are back on and the truck is on the ground, we'll give those a click as well. Don't you worry though, we still have plenty of broken stuff, like this seat that is only attached on 3 corners, for some reason. There's no way that's gonna come off of there, right? Huh, wrong. The front corner of that outer seat rail isn't looking any better, although it's at least still attached. And yeah, 2 for 2, that's another perfectly intact mounting stud. The inner rail appears to be nice and solid, and also separates without a fight. Then the entire seat can come out, so we can figure out how to fix this, once the remaining rust chunks have been peeled off the floor. Clearly, that outer rail is completely toast, and the spring on the other side is also busted, which explains some things, so we'll need some replacement parts. This absolute specimen of a junkyard blazer was more than willing to help, and despite a lot of external rust and internal mold, the seat rail looked a heck of a lot better than mine. So on it goes, and once the bolts are snug, the forward spring has been replaced, and the adjuster lever is hooked up, we'll drop the seat back onto its mounting studs. All 4 corners will get tightened down with fresh junkyard hardware for the outer rail, and we're back in business like nothing ever happened. Which is great, because it was repaired just in time to head towards the Mountain Mamas of West Virginia, where Sean had just bought land and we were having an inaugural campout. Despite being on the small side, the Blazer is great for camping and feels right at home out in the woods. We all had such a good time that 2 months later, I enjoyed a lovely January night sleeping in it again. Yeah, that was a lie. It was frickin' cold, the coldest night's sleep I have ever gotten, but at least I woke up to this lovely Sistine Chapel-esque ice pattern on the roof over my head. Not too long after that trip, the very slow oil drain plug leak that I was perfectly content pretending didn't exist evolved from a drip into a drip, necessitating the drain pan that found a long-term home underneath the engine. A home under a home, in fact, since these damn birds won't leave the Blazer uninhabited. Anyway, the oil leak is something I have more direct control over, so I should probably find a way to seal it up. Back when half of this oil pan was still in the 4.3 liter V6, the drain threads completely disintegrated and we welded a 1/2-inch nut to the outside while the pan was still installed. We covered over that less than ideal situation with JB Weld, and it stayed totally sealed for years. But those past sins have come a-callin', so once we flush out as much oil as we can and leave it to drain for 2 weeks while the snow melts, we'll wire wheel off all of that epoxy and get down to bare steel. Well, it's worse than I remember. It's pretty impressive that the JB Weld sealed for as long as it did. After a final round of degreasing, we'll mix up some quick weld and slather on 2 coats. Since it was pretty cold out, we left that for a few days, and with the world's ugliest sealing washer on it, we'll torque the bolt to 30 foot-pounds and give the area a nice light coat of paint. Finally, we'll add in fresh oil, and impressively, it is still holding onto it today. Also still hanging in there is the battery, which has been begging me to let it return to the ocean for years. Oh. But it somehow still holds a short-term charge, so the poor thing has been jump-started dozens upon dozens of times. Sometimes several in a row. Sorry to wake you up, bud. Shit. It's generally good about starting though, and hums along effortlessly once it starts to warm up. Well, it was going okay. Now and then it'll piddle a little bit of something, but it almost always just needs an extra turn of a worm gear, or, in some cases, a few extra clamps. As long as you check for a nest before turning on the radiator fans, you're golden. But I truly am not one to leave well enough alone, and have always had ideas for Blazer upgrades. Mostly they get pushed out of the way by more pressing projects, since this thing somehow still runs and drives, But when Neil wanted to meet up at the Carlisle Truck Nationals for the 40th anniversary of the S10, I couldn't help but feel embarrassed by how slow it was on the poorly tuned Quadrajet. Starts great, it idles okay, but going down the road there is a lot of room for improvement. It probably doesn't even stand a chance against a stock 4.3 liter. I think a lot of it's because I never tuned the carburetor. It was clearly set up for a much bigger engine, and it's still actually missing some pieces. And it did get better fuel economy than the Edelbrock it replaced, but it always felt pretty lazy, and I'd like to wake the engine back up, as much as is possible. I just don't have the parts or expertise to make this work, and it's gonna come off of there later anyway, so I just want something that's gonna make the Blazer more fun to drive. This is a Holley 600 CFM, a very standard sort of base model unit. And I originally bought it to add an electric choke to the Pinto, but since that has bigger problems at the moment, the Blazer can borrow it for now. We have a generic return spring kit and proper cable studs. The main trick will be the throttle cable stuff. The Picasso bracket that was on there has already been modified to hell and back, so this one made for this exact setup should save us a good deal of time. The redundant brake booster vacuum port is in the way of progress, so off it comes, and the fast idle screw does not get along with the manifold, so we'll dig out a 1/2-inch phenolic spacer to separate them. Finally, the carburetor is fully installed, but the issues just keep on coming. The cable to the transmission needs to be set up precisely, but it's not adjusting at wide open throttle. This bracket needs to be farther back than it is. Which isn't an option for this application-specific bracket that doesn't fit its specific application, so back to the patchwork bracket we go. It's close, but still too short to adjust, until we add a TV cable corrector spring made to allow for higher shift pressures, but used here to act as a spacer. It came out probably 2 clicks. It's not super ideal, but I convinced myself it was worth a try and proceeded to set up everything else. I'm gonna go hit the fuel pump. With the carb full and the accelerator pump spraying, it's time to turn the key. It started immediately, which is a nice refreshing change of pace, and the idle is very high, but at least it sounds decent. For about a minute, at which point it's running pretty poorly. The choke is already fully open, leaning out the fuel mixture, and the engine clearly isn't ready for that. And it really isn't ready to be loaded up in gear. The choke is opening way too fast. The setting looks pretty normal. The cap appears to be installed correctly, so just to see what'll happen, we'll give her all she's got and turn it way past the rich end of the scale. Which does cause it to stay closed for longer, as it should, and suggests that the spring or heating element inside the cap is to blame. For definitive proof of this, we'll do a test with the engine off, the cap turned to full rich, and the battery on a charger with the cap wired straight to it. Without the additional heat produced by the engine, the choke flap reached its fully open position in just about 2 minutes. Which seems awfully fast, but it just so happens that we have 2 more of this exact model of carburetor for comparison. And what do you know, under the same testing conditions, those opened at a consistent and substantially slower rate. So, we're gonna borrow one of those known good caps, swap it onto the Blazer, and one final test confirms that it now opens at a reasonable pace. My best guess is that the clock spring in this one has a metallurgic or heat treat problem, but either way, we have a good one on there now that takes somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 minutes to open, which seems just about perfect. We'll take a few minutes to let it fully warm up and improve the idle mixture and speed settings, at which point I needed to know if any of this effort was worth it, so we'll go for a spin around the block. It feels sketchy as hell. There's a little dead spot off idle and the shifting is a little funny, which is a problem since we don't have room to adjust the transmission cable. I decided to switch the Frankenstein bracket out for this adjustable one with a TV cable add-on, but I couldn't get the right length of pull for both cables at the same time, even after modifications. We don't quite have full throttle, but at least the transmission should survive the upcoming trip to Pennsylvania. Just 3 weeks later though, fate came a-callin' and changed my plans once again.
I think I hear something in the distance. What is that? Oh no, it's him.
Rob's Jeep Cherokee blew a tire, and due to the terrible condition of all of them, he needed a full set. We decided that this was a chance to upsize the tires on both of our vehicles, despite neither having a ton of room to spare, so we dragged all 8 wheels to the tire shop for a switcheroo. The Jeep got the 31s off of the Blazer, and I got to make some big decisions about where to go with this thing, especially since we're already asking a lot of the factory 15x6 Steelies with 10.5-inch wide tires. Long story short, I decided to step up to a 16x8-inch wheel in order to run 285/75 R16s, essentially 33x11.
The first thing I noticed when opening these wasn't the size or the color or anything like that. It was the weight. Holy crap.
The selection in this size, bolt pattern, and price range was pretty much just these, and this setup seems pretty overkill for the little truck, but it should work out okay.
Max load for a single tire is 3,750 pounds, which is actually very close to what the Blazer weighs on 4 tires.
These wheels are going to stick out 2.5 inches farther, which is definitely going to cause some problems, but that's just more motivation to install the 5-inch lift that's been sitting on my shelf for years. Until then, we may have to deal with a less than ideal fitment, but there's no going back now.
The good news is that all the tires are on the wheels. The bad news is that they're not balanced.
There was some disagreement between the techs about the reading being correct and the weight being excessive, so we ended up deciding that it'd be better to recheck them after a few drives. To hopefully keep them from shaking loose, we've got new lug nuts, since I couldn't in good faith reuse the old ones, and after a bit of surface prep, we'll drop in a center cap and hoist the new shoes into place.
The biggest issue is going to be this right down in here.
And the gap sure doesn't get better when the suspension is loaded up.
It's jammed up against it now. It's not real surprising. And the stick out, there's a lot in the front. And the alignment, pretty questionable.
I'd like to call the fitment a mixed success.
That's 3/4 of a turn of the steering wheel.
Although perhaps that is being overly positive. And of course, we already have the torsion keys maxed out.
Since they're only rubbing on the inner fender, they shouldn't hurt anything. It's maybe a little bit embarrassing sounding in a parking lot, but look at the rest of this thing. Should I really be that worried about it?
We'll take it easy on the hairpin turns, and, in all likelihood, we should survive, but there will be at least one other part of the truck actively attempting sabotage.
I built pretty much this whole exhaust system almost from scratch, like 5 or 6 years ago, and winters have not been kind to it. You can see, especially underneath the heat wrap and anywhere a weld was, there is quite a lot of rust. I don't actually know how many holes there are in the system, because I'm too afraid to touch the rusty areas and make more, but it's not good. I was planning on making a new one anyway, so there's not really any point in trying to make band-aid fixes. Just gonna have to deal with that.
With the date of the truck show fast approaching, my standards are rapidly falling, but after evicting the usual squatters, we should at least take this stinker for a test drive.
Got it up to just over 70 miles an hour. Didn't feel significant vibration, but it does feel squirrely, and that probably has something to do with whatever's going on in regards to the alignment. Looks like there's some toe issue there, and the passenger side has a pretty large amount of negative camber. Could be the upper control arm crumbling a little bit.
But I think it's more likely that the offset of these wheels is just making existing issues look a lot worse. We certainly aren't going to give this death trap a proper alignment, but we've got an angle gauge and precision eyeballs on our side, so how could this go wrong? Starting off at the crusty upper control arms, which did come off to install poly bushings, but that couldn't possibly have anything to do with today's level of ka-chow, we'll crack loose the mounting nuts and give the camber bolts a calibrated turn, which, after some guess and check, landed us at
89.8. I think that's gonna be good.
So we'll lock that in.
Doesn't look stupid anymore. We're gonna call that good. Now we just have to do the same thing on the driver's side. I think that's as good as we can get. It's pretty much maxed out. Dum 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 dum. 89.3 looks like our number. It looks pretty good to the eye. Okay, that's the camber angle covered. Now we need to set the toe, which should be fairly easy as long as these adjusters are gonna cooperate. Ow. Ow. Okay, slicey, slicey, cutty, cutty time.
Fortunately, the passenger side bolts came right out and both adjusters are turning, so it's tape measure time.
64 5/8. And that is 64 1/4.
And after some back and forth changes,
58 3/16. 58 1/16. I'm good with that.
to keep that setting, we'll use new bolts raised up with split locks for wrench clearance. And once they are comfortably snug, the front end is at a much better place than when we started. Now it at least looks like it would roll in a straight line. Although, thanks to our next predicament, that appearance is quite deceiving. Since we just recently tore apart a nearly identical column in the 78 Firebird, fixing a milder version of this issue, we'll save those of you with steering-related trauma the trouble of fast-forwarding by spinning that belabored task off into a separate video. In summary, it was a pain, but everything ended up nice and solid and far more confidence-inspiring. Unlike the cooling ability of these front-mounted radiator fans. When basking at a stoplight on an 80+ degree day, the engine temp will slowly climb from its normal 195 all the way up to 230. At which point I'll turn on the cabin heat to keep that from getting worse at the cost of the skin melting off of my face until we're free to continue rolling. The factors behind this are likely multifaceted, but these fans would be far more efficient mounted behind the radiator, being asked to pull air instead of push it. If only somebody hadn't left an accessory drive in the way. But, I thought, why let the natural laws of physics stop me, and remove the fans to see where they could be squeezed.
Okay, well, minor dilemma. Unfortunately, there's pretty much no position to keep this fan away from the water pump pulley.
We do have a minor victory, however, in that the driver's side fan can fit with a reasonable amount of clearance. So, all we have to do is flip the fan blade back to its original orientation. Or do we? We've had some comments in the past arguing that the blade should not be flipped when changing from a pull to a push, just the wire polarity.
I thought this would be a chance to do a fun, highly unscientific experiment. The blades may not be immensely directional, but they curve in opposite directions, and that can have a pretty big effect. Now we have the fan blades mounted in opposite directions.
Do both fans move air? Yes. Do they do so equally? No.
It might not be as clear as it feels to me just holding my hands over these fans, but this one is moving a lot more air, and it's moving it centrally, while this one has almost no air movement right around the center, and it's coming out diagonally. It's more turbulent. There is a significant difference between the fan directions.
No surprises there, but how about a different comparison?
This is an S-blade fan. I've heard these sometimes can move less air, but they end up being a little bit quieter. As far as noise, I'm hard-pressed to tell a difference. The column of air is about the same size. I do feel like this guy moves a little bit more air overall.
But for now, we're sticking with these time-tested, repeatedly roasted units, which will end up mounted high up on the driver's side and low down on the front passenger side of the radiator.
The difference in felt airflow behind the radiator is enormous. It demonstrates why fans are typically mounted behind the radiator unless there's no other option. I'm very curious to see what this does on the road,
and since we need to leave in less than 24 hours, we'll be finding out soon. But, despite the impending deadline, I couldn't help but indulge an intrusive thought.
Electric fans are a lot less scary to me than engine-driven fans, but it's still spinning pretty fast.
Which is where this calibrated finger-analogous meat tube comes in.
Yeah, that's pretty gross. I just kind of shaved it.
It didn't seem like it wanted to consume the hot dog, but kind of wanted to one more run and just really push it into the blades. Just got splattered.
Oh, everything smells like a hot dog. That pretty well demonstrates that even plastic-bladed electric fans deserve respect, and that I should not be allowed unsupervised access to the refrigerator. The next day, with a clearer head and significantly less hot dog juice on my shirt, there are just a few last things to take care of before we leave. This thing is gross. It's been on here for years. You can hear the idle RPM decrease when you put the air filter lid on. It ended up being a little bit hard to get a replacement one. Third time's the charm though, and I think this is gonna work. A larger diameter filter runs into the radiator hose, so we'll stick with what we know fits. And after a proper goodbye to the old one, huck it in the garbage, the engine can now breathe easy. How about its lifeblood though? There is a long-standing mystery surrounding this thing's oil pressure, considering that the crankshaft had some less than stellar surfaces that received a sandpaper polish, and the fact that the gauge keeps its intel close to its chest. Every once in a while it moves, but I don't think you can really read into it too much. Typically, it sits at either 0 or 20, but if you catch it under a blood moon, there is a small period of time where it reads nice and high. I'm doubtful we'll fix that today, but I did notice a leak after messing with the throttle cable bracket that traced back to this. That sender is totally loose. It'd be pretty cool if that also fixed the pressure gauge. We're going to take this opportunity to get an accurate reading by swapping that out for a mechanical gauge. And although it's a cold idle, 45 psi is perfectly respectable. So I can feel a bit better about overall engine condition, and tightening down the sender did stop the leak, but the gauge is still more of a yes than it is numerically informative. That'll have to do though. This thing is supposed to be in Pennsylvania in 12 hours, so we gotta get hurrying and leave. Round trip, we're looking at something like 300 miles? You got it in you, bud. One way or another. My partner and I were making an overnight stop in West Virginia before heading up north, and other than this thing's typical amount of steering wander and some tire rubbing, the first leg of the drive was totally without issue. The next morning started off pretty foggy, but it was starting to clear up by the time we reached the highway.
Nice wide turns. That's all she got. It's not a lot. There's a little bit of shake from the tires, but it's not terrible. That's about 80. It's about as fast as this should go.
Although the sun coming out would have been nice for the vibes, the clouds overhead did help keep the hot day from becoming unbearable. The engine temp did climb, rolling around at low speeds, but it never got out of hand, so maybe the fan changes did make some small difference. Eventually, it was clear that we were nearing the Carlisle Fairgrounds when sightings of modified trucks increased, and after a not inconsiderable traffic jam, we finally arrived and even got a spot right next to Neil's fabulous chopped street rod. Since I'd never driven into an event like this before, it was a really interesting experience, and no matter the types of looks we got, it was clear that everyone was having a good time. There were trucks, and more trucks as far as the eye could see, and more S10s than an impound lot on Sunday morning. Between the partying, the burnout contest, and the stunt shows, there was something for anyone who had ever found enjoyment in motor vehicles beyond sports cars. After saying our goodbyes to both old and new friends, we headed out as the sun dropped low in the sky. Thankfully, the drive back to West Virginia that night was entirely uneventful, as was the drive home to Maryland the next day. The Blazer may be slow, loud, hot, and occasionally smell like the inside of a tailpipe, but it really does just keep on trucking.
We're back.
It was really fun to go to the show. One of the organizers told us there were 96 S10s there that day, but I didn't see a lot of four-wheel drive ones, and I don't think I saw a single other four-wheel drive V8. That probably says more about the types of vehicles people bring to car shows than it does about the uniqueness of this one, but I'm still very happy to have this pile of extremely lovable scrap metal to call my own. And that's really the last adventure this truck has seen. Since then, it's rarely left the driveway and even more rarely left the yard, due to a bunch of outside factors as well as a few internal developments, like the fully Swiss cheesed exhaust system and the fact that somebody filled the back of the poor thing with engine parts. But the Blazer still has purposes to serve, and until I devote time to once again resuscitating it, the local wildlife couldn't be more happy with their ever-present habitat. These little fellows grew up safe and sound thanks to the hole punched in the grill and my automotive neglect. So, can you really blame me for not having replaced the front end, supercharged the engine, and lifted it yet? Well, I mean, I guess you can, but come on, look at those weird little sky chickens and forget about my lack of follow-through.
And all we're gonna do is flip it around, put it on the right way.
When these tires showed up, I was like, where am I gonna put them? I could put them in the truck, but it's gonna make the Blazer really stinky. Well, I did it anyway, and what do you know? The summer heat has really brought out the aroma.
Of course. Ow.
Can I get a reverse? Nope. Come back, you're not dead yet, come on.
Got an 8mm nut holding that fan on.
Yeah, gonna need two hands. Yeah.